In a sleepy village nestled at the edge of a dense forest, there stood a church so ancient it seemed to have been there since the dawn of time. Its stone walls were weathered, its once grand windows now shattered, and its bell tower stood crooked, as though the weight of centuries had caused it to lean toward the earth in quiet surrender. The villagers, most of whom had long since abandoned it for a newer church in the town square, had all but forgotten the place. But the church, with its dark history and lingering secrets, had never forgotten them. It was on a stormy night in early autumn, when Thomas, a young priest from the village, was assigned to look after the church. His predecessor, Father Henry, had fallen ill, and so Thomas was called to step in. Reluctantly, he agreed. He'd heard the rumors, of course, about the old church, but he was a man of faith, and felt confident that he could handle whatever lay within its crumbling walls. He arrived after dark, the wind howling as the rain beat down on the roof. The doors creaked open with an eerie groan, and Thomas stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The smell of mildew and old wood filled the air, but what struck him most was the oppressive silence. It was as if the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. After lighting a few candles and saying a quiet prayer, Thomas began his rounds, making sure everything was in order. The pews, though aged, stood firm. The altar, though dust-covered, still had the faintest glimmer of gold on its carvings. It looked like a place that had once been loved and revered. But then, in the corner of the church, Thomas saw it, a small wooden door, hidden beneath a faded tapestry. He had never seen it before, and it was so out of place in a church that had been used for centuries. His curiosity got the better of him, and he approached the door, his heart beginning to race for reasons he couldn't quite explain. The door opened with an unsettling creak, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward, into darkness. There was a chill in the air, colder than it should have been. His breath came out in a fog as he descended, the stairs groaning under his weight. At the bottom, he found himself in a small, windowless chamber. The stone walls were slick with moisture and the floor was uneven, as though it had been hastily constructed. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, sat an old book, its cover made of worn black leather, and its pages yellowed with age. Thomas felt an overwhelming urge to open the book, though he could not explain why. He reached for it with trembling hands and slowly lifted it from the pedestal. As he opened it, the air around him seemed to grow heavier, and he could hear faint whispers, barely audible, as though the church itself was murmuring. The words in the book were written in a language Thomas did not recognize, but the symbols seemed to twist and writhe on the pages as if they were alive. He couldn't tear his eyes away, and before he knew it, he was speaking the words aloud despite knowing he should stop. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the room grew impossibly cold. The air around him thickened, pressing down on his chest, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward him, coiling like serpents. He heard something move behind him, slow, dragging footsteps. He turned, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The candles he had lit flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. As they died one by one, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, swallowing the room whole. The whispers turned to voices, and the voices began to chant, speaking in a low, guttural tone. "You shouldn't have read it. You shouldn't have come." In a panic, Thomas dropped the book, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air for a moment before it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The ground beneath him began to shake violently, and he heard the sound of something scratching, clawing at the walls as though something were trying to break through. The stone walls cracked, and from the fissures dark oozing tendrils began to emerge, wrapping around the pillars and floor, spreading like a disease. The voices grew louder, now screaming, their words incomprehensible but filled with rage and sorrow. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the chamber, tall and cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by the hood. It moved toward Thomas, its feet never touching the ground, as though it floated on a cloud of darkness. Its hands, long and twisted, reached out toward him. He tried to run, but his feet felt heavy as though the ground itself was holding him in place. The figure reached for him, its touch freezing cold, and when its fingers brushed his skin, Thomas's body went rigid. The room around him seemed to collapse in on itself, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. In that moment, Thomas realized with a sinking heart that he had awakened something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries in the depths of the church. The whispers had belonged to the souls trapped here, cursed by the very church they had once worshipped in. They had been sealed away for a reason, and now they had been set free. When the villagers found the church the next morning, there was no sign of Thomas. The doors to the secret chamber were sealed shut, and the air around the church felt wrong. Some said they could hear faint whispers on the wind carried by the breeze. Others spoke of a shadow that lingered in the churchyard, watching, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to disturb the church's dark secret. But as the years passed, the church was left to rot in the forest, a forgotten place of darkness. And no one dared to venture near again except for the brave or the foolish, who would never return, leaving only the whispers in the wind. It was a cold, foggy evening when Sister Agnes arrived at the convent for the first time. The year was 1903, and the once beautiful structure had been abandoned for over a decade, its halls now shrouded in silence and decay. The townspeople whispered about it in hushed tones, their words steeped in fear. They spoke of things that lurked in the shadows, of strange noises in the dead of night. But to Sister Agnes, it was merely a place in need of salvation, a broken sanctuary for the broken-hearted. She had been sent there by the bishop, a woman of deep faith, chosen for her devotion and desire to restore the convent to its former glory. The assignment had been a privilege, or so she believed. As she walked through the iron gates, her footsteps were the only sound that broke the stillness. The church loomed ahead, its spires piercing the heavy sky. The bell tower was cracked. The stained glass windows shattered, and vines had begun to creep over the stone walls. Inside, it was even worse. The air smelled of mildew, dust thick on every surface. Yet there was something oddly compelling about it, a sense of history, a presence that both soothed and unsettled her. Sister Agnes set about her work, cleaning the chapel, repairing broken pews and sweeping away the dust of years. The first few days were uneventful, just as she had expected. But as the sun began to set earlier each day, a strange unease began to settle over her. The other nuns, if there had been any, were long gone. The silence that enveloped the convent at night felt unnatural, as though it held something dark in its grip. One evening, after finishing her prayers, Agnes wandered into the convent's vast empty hallways. She was drawn to a door at the far end of the corridor, one she had not noticed before. It was old, worn, with carvings of angels and saints barely visible under years of dust. She hesitated for a moment, but something urged her to open it. The room was small, dimly lit by the dying light from the hallway. Inside, an old wooden chair sat before a mirror, cracked and tarnished with age. The reflection in the mirror was strangely distorted, as though the glass itself was reluctant to reveal the truth. But it was the chair that drew Agnes's attention. There was something about it that felt familiar, a sense of dread, a memory long buried. She stepped closer, and as she did, the temperature in the room dropped. Her breath fogged in the cold air. The mirror seemed to shift, and for a split second she saw a figure. A woman, dressed in a nun's habit, her face obscured by shadows. The air grew heavy, and Agnes's heartbeat quickened. She turned to leave, but the door behind her slammed shut with an unnatural force. The room was no longer just a place of solitude. It had become something else entirely. Something hungry. A low, guttural whisper echoed from the corners of the room. "You shouldn't be here." She never left. Sister Agnes froze. The voice was soft at first, barely a breath. But it grew louder, more insistent. She spun around to face the mirror once again. This time the reflection was different. No longer a shadow, but a face. And yet, it wasn't. The face in the mirror was pale, almost sickly, its eyes wide open in terror. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the mirror held a trapped, tortured soul, one that had once been Sister Agnes, but now was nothing more than a hollow vessel. She reached out to touch the glass, and as her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the reflection moved on its own, twisting and contorting into a grotesque parody of herself. The whispering grew louder, now filling the entire room. It was no longer just a voice, it was a chorus, chanting in a language Sister Agnes could not understand. The temperature dropped to an unbearable cold, and the air seemed to grow thicker, suffocating her. In a blind panic, she tried to turn, but the room was no longer the same. The walls began to warp, bending toward her as though they had a life of their own. Her footsteps echoed strangely, as if she were no longer walking on solid ground. The mirror, now alive with movement, seemed to mock her every step. Suddenly, the air was pierced by a deafening, distorted cry, a scream of agony so pure, so tortured, that it felt as if it were tearing the very fabric of reality apart. And then there was silence. Sister Agnes awoke, but it wasn't in the room. It was in a small, darkened cell, the walls pressed close around her. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and uneven. Her hands trembled as she reached up to touch her face, and to her horror, she found that it was no longer her own. The skin had become pale and waxy, the eyes sunken and hollow. The mirror had taken her. The whispers returned, but now they came from within her own mind. "You are one of us now. You will never leave." She reached for the door, but the cold fingers of the convent's curse gripped her tightly, refusing to let her go. No one ever saw Sister Agnes again. Her body was never found, and the convent remained abandoned, its mysteries locked away. The townspeople still speak of the place, warning travelers to never go near. And on the coldest of nights, if you listen closely, you might hear the faintest whisper in the wind. She never left.